Hello, friends. We are excited that our No Small Endeavor Plus community is growing. Now, all of our friends in the No Small Endeavor orbit are intelligent, smarter than average, winsome, good-looking, while the members of NSE Plus seem especially so because they are enjoying ad-free episodes as well as special subscriber-only content once a month where we discuss habits and practices learned from our guests over the years. And those special episodes have been a lot of fun, personal and practical. I love sitting down with our producer, Jacob Lewis, and recording those for you. And so we would love to have you join us. And your NSE Plus membership helps support the show. So because of all of these things, we'd love for you to join the NSE Plus family. Just go to nosmallendeavor.com, click subscribe, and start catching up on our subscriber-only episodes today. Again, go now, nosmallendeavor.com, click subscribe, and start catching up. See you there. Hello, friends. I'm Lee C. Camp. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Malcolm Gladwell. At the end of every year for many years now, way back into what used to be called Token's Show, we've done a year-end show at one of the big historic or beautiful theaters downtown Nashville. This year we did our Thanksgiving show at the beautiful Schermerhorn Symphony Hall downtown. Invited in Malcolm Gladwell for that show. And prior to the show, on the Friday before the Sunday evening show, we did a small private interview taping for about an hour and a half with Malcolm. And it was just a delightful time with Malcolm, both the interview that you're going to hear here, as well as the live show at the Schermerhorn. It also included Vince Gill, Wendy Moten, Brian Sutton, a chorus, and a string section from the orchestra. It was just a lovely, wonderful evening. And getting ready for the time with Malcolm, at first, of course, I was just curious about his stories and the way he uncovers so many of the fascinating stories he does. But increasingly, I got curious more and more simply about Malcolm and took that kind of approach in the interview you're going to hear. How did Malcolm become Malcolm? And how did Malcolm become a person who's curious in the way that he is? It was a really wonderful and moving interview. If you would like to hear the interview segments from the live show at the Schermerhorn, we're going to be releasing that on NSE Plus. If you're not a member of NSE Plus, you can go over to our website, nosmallendeavor.com, and click subscribe and get access to that special extra content. Enjoy. Malcolm Timothy Gladwell, Canadian journalist and author. He's been a staff writer for The New Yorker since 1996. Wrote for The Washington Post for 10 years. Malcolm has published 7 books with at least 5 New York Times bestsellers. He was appointed to the Order of Canada in 2011. And he is the host of the podcast Revisionist History. Please make welcome Malcolm Gladwell. Welcome to Nashville again.
Thank you.
Good to have you back here in Music City.
I am, yeah.
I understand that you've at least had a number of entertaining episodes. Certainly those of us who've listened to your podcast a good bit know of fascinating conversations with fascinating Nashvillians. But you recently, like today, told me a very entertaining story about a Nashville experience that you once had that seems classic Nashville to me. And you were running.
I went running. This is actually, I think, now that I reflect on it after talking to you about it, I think this is the perfect Nashville story.
Yes.
If that doesn't raise the bar too high.
Yeah.
I'm a runner, and everyone tells me I got to run in Percy Warner Park. So I make my way out there, get stuck in traffic, get there a little late.
So far, it is the perfect Nashville story.
Yeah. I think it's July. It's probably 90 some odd, super humid. Still the perfect Nashville story.
Yeah.
And I decided it's too hot to go running with my t-shirt. So I just wear a pair of shorts, right? Which you could do, right? I go running.
Which you can do, I guess.
Which I can do. So I go off and I climb that big road. I'm going around Percy Warner Park, and it's a little late. It starts to get a little dark, but I think I'm fine, but I get lost. Not just mildly lost, like completely 100%. I have no idea where I am. I can't see any lights. What am I going to do? So I'm drenched in sweat, and I'm just wearing a pair of shorts. And I stand by the side of the road, and I hitchhike. I'm like, someone's got to... So like big, beefy guys in like Ford F-150s, don't stop. Take one look at me, just no part of it. Finally, a girl, and I say a girl because she was probably in her early 20s, She's a little battered Honda Accord. Stops, roll down the window. Can I help you, sir? And I said, I leaned in the window. I was like, first of all, you should not be picking me up. Are you nuts? Like, what are you doing? It's like, strange dude in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. Like, what? Anyway, I get in, and I said, why did you do that? And she said, well, I was coming from Bible study, and today we studied the story of the Good Samaritan. And that is the perfect Nashville story.
So as a boy, you lived in like 3 countries, at least briefly. Is that what I understand
Born
correctly?
in England, spent some time in Jamaica. My mom's Jamaican. And then we moved to Canada. And then I came down here.
So your father's Englishman.
My dad is an Englishman. My mom's. They met in college, University College London in the 50s.
You have many memories of Jamaica at all?
Well, we would go there regularly when I was growing up. And so I do have memory. Eventually, most of my family there moved to Canada and the U.S. But when I was a kid, we were.
Yeah. Did all of those experiences, what do you think that did for your just sense of self or sense of identity? All of those different, diverse experiences as a young boy.
Well, I'm a strong believer in the idea that we have multiple identities and that we have the right to rank them in the order that we choose. And that this is an overly kind of aggressive answer to this question. One of the things that irritates me about the world is that the world sometimes chooses for you how to rank your own identities. And I'm like, no, you don't get to tell me how So I always think of my mom who, to give you, for example, my mom is a black woman, a Jamaican, a woman, a Christian, a therapist, a writer, a mother, and a wife, and a Canadian.
And what?
Canadian. Now. I mean, I could keep going. I would say that over the course of her life, the way she ranks all of those identities has changed. And I think it constantly changes. And I think she even, and I think she's 92. I think they may change again. I don't know. But like the world, various people in the world would look at her and say maybe she's number one, a black woman. And she would say, I don't know. I might have been number one, a black woman when I was 23 and in England for the first time and being treated like, less than a full person. But I haven't been treated that way in 30 years. Why should I foreground that identity? Anyway, that idea that there are many parts of us and we get to choose which part is most important I think that's what I picked up from all of those kind of shifting situations, environments when I was a kid.
So 2 follow-up questions on that. One, will you unpack more why that sharply irritates? What about that earlier move sharply irritates you? Well,
because it diminishes. When we do that to people, we diminish their humanity. And we presume to understand them when in fact we don't. And so did I get in trouble? I have part of a company. This was in the news this week. And we have these company meetings every now and again. And I did an Ask Me Anything with the staff. And someone said, did I worry? Asked in a relatively hostile way. Someone who's no longer with the company, by the way. Although this has nothing to do with that. Did I think the company was sufficiently diverse? And I said 2 things in response. One is, don't I count? And the second thing I said was, I said to the whole staff, if any of you is a Republican, raise your hand. And no one did. And I said, well, if we're going to call ourselves a diverse company, shouldn't we have some Republicans? Now, this was treated like I had said some terrible thing. I'm serious. I mean, my definition of diversity encompasses a dozen different dimensions of human complexity. And I think I actually value diversity I take it very seriously. And the book I'm reading right now has a lot about diversity. But my definition of diversity is broad. If I had my way, we would have more of every kind of person, and we would be a richer place for it. And I object to a definition of diversity that is super narrow. And so that's why this is a kind of top of mind issue for me.
So back to your childhood, and you said that you think that experience allowed you to begin to pay attention to multiplicity of identities and the possibility of ranking those. When you look back at that young Malcolm, what were some of the key identities for him at that time, being raised in Canada?
Well, so I'll tell you another story. My dad, who passed sadly a few years ago, but who was a marvelously independent-minded man, had a big beard. He was a mathematician, and he always dressed in a suit and a tie. Even when he was gardening, which is his favorite thing. But
he was an Englishman, I suppose.
He was an Englishman. Took it very seriously. But we lived in this Mennonite community. He loved the Mennonites and was sort of thought everything they did was kind of fascinating. And they used to have barn raisings. When a barn burned down, they would all gather. These were mostly conservative Mennonites, so people who drove horses and buggies. They would all they would get together like the next weekend, hundreds of them. They would descend on that farm, and they would rebuild the barn in essentially a day, right? This famous barn raising. My dad decided when I was a kid once that he would attend a barn raising. So if you can imagine, we drove, off into the middle of the countryside in a Volvo, of course.
And he's not Mennonite at this point.
No, he's a Presbyterian with a big beard and an English accent. And wearing a suit and tie. So we get in our Volvo. Of course, we have a Volvo. We drive to this thing, and he shows up, and everyone else, his Mennonites are clean shaven, and they're all wearing black cloth garments, and they have their horses and buggies out front, and they all go to the same church, and they all know each other. And this Englishman with a PhD in advanced mathematics shows up in his Volvo with his 3 sons in tow and announces he'd like to join. Right? Now, they were fine with it. They gave him stuff to do and blah, blah, blah. But my point is, my dad was the kind of person who, it never occurred to him that was a socially awkward thing to do. It just didn't occur to him. He was like, I'm your neighbor. I live down the road. I know some of you. I love farming. He wanted to be a farmer. I mean, there was no part of him, he believed in the same God. God, what does the Bible say? It says, help your neighbor. So he was there, right? That's what I grew up with. Now, would I do that? Probably not. But it's an incredibly powerful influence on you to have as a father someone who does that without even thinking about it. I mean, he never even discussed it with us. He's just like, we're going, get in, right? And came back and thought it was like the best experience. So,
were you bookish as a boy?
I was. My father would take me. We're talking a lot about my dad. I'll warn you. I get very emotional about my father, so I have to limit. He would take me out of school and take me to university and just deposit me in the library, and it was the happiest. It's like, those are my happiest childhood memories, are playing hooky. It wasn't hooky. What do you call it when it's being done with your parents' consent? I don't know what that is, but it was parental hooky that we played. And I would just wander around the university library, but, it'd be 10 or 11. And then I'd have lunch with him and have a hamburger in the cafeteria. It was fantastic. Never had hamburgers at home.
I think I heard you say in some interview that maybe your mother would sign false.
Oh, that was later. My mom then became deeply complicit in my truancy, and she would. My mother, who's strategically way ahead of me, even to this day, she understood that I was going to seek to rebel as a teenager. And so she decided what she would do is just anticipate it and meet me there. So she, at one point, when she saw that I wasn't that interested in going to school, she would write notes. Malcolm is sick today and cannot attend school, and leave the date blank and just give me a bunch of them.
Amazing.
In retrospect, so genius. Like, how do you rebel against that? She's like already signed off on it. Like, it's fine, whatever. Do it to you.
Did you rebel as a teenager?
No, how could I? My mother foreclosed that responsibility, that avenue.
You strike me as a very, if I were to think of one or two words in thinking about the kind of work you do, I think curiosity would be certainly high on the list. Where do you see that coming from your childhood?
Well, I'm going to talk to my dad again. This is turning into the Graham Gladwell show, which is fine, actually.
What's his name? Graham?
Graham Morris Lester Gladwell. He was deep. I realized, it took me a long time to realize this was unusual in someone. But in his obituary, I wrote that he considered himself an expert in only three things: mathematics, gardening, and the Bible. And on everything else, he was open to suggestion. And that was really his position, that he just assumed, if he met someone, that they knew more than he did on their subjects of choice, and that he should just ask questions and learn. And my whole childhood was spent listening to my father meet random strangers, figure out what areas they knew more about than he did, and him asking them questions. I thought that was normal. I discovered later that that's not normal, but so I had a kind of model of this kind of extreme, and a lot of it was grounded in he had no insecurities about declaring himself ignorant in an area. I didn't have a problem with that. It's like, oh, I don't know anything about that, right? Even on things he knew a lot about, if he met a theologian, he wouldn't even pretend to know more about them than the Bible. He just knew, or gardening. If he thought that you knew more about delphiniums than he did, he was all ears. Let's go. It was a kind of extreme version of, he had a kind of radical curiosity. Again, I don't think I can match that, but it's a really powerful model to be given as a kid.
How do you think the virtue of humility, I mean, I would assume there's like almost a direct correlation or causative effect between humility and curiosity, but how do you think about that?
Oh, I agree. I would agree to that. I would think it's impossible without having. It's odd though. So there's two parts of it. One is humility, that you don't presume that you know things you don't know. But you also have to have a lot of self-confidence, because you have to be completely indifferent to the consequences of letting the world know about what you don't know. You have to not care, right? And you have to have my dad was a supremely self-confident person. So that allowed him, I think, to kind of expose himself in this way as being, he didn't have any kind of hang up. Like when most people, the real reason people aren't curious, I think, is not so much that they lack humility, but that they lack confidence. And they're not willing to kind of show themselves to the world and as not knowing things.
So fast forward to your vocation, you've said at one point, I just want to explain things to people.
Yeah, so this, as a kid, we're talking excessively about my family, if that's okay. Is that okay?
We're going to move on in a minute.
Okay.
Go ahead.
There are two things. So my family's divided down the middle. There's my mom and me on one side, and then there's everybody else, my brothers and my father. My father and my brothers were incapable of explaining things. So my father would just go, and then my brother, Jeff, who I love dearly, just would talk endlessly and not get anywhere. And as a kid, this drove me crazy. So you know how you're constantly playing games as a kid, and there's always a moment where you've got to teach your cousin how to play hearts. And so my father would be incapable, and my brother would give this incredibly long explanation of it going over. And then finally, in frustration, I would just say, okay, everyone shut up. This is how you play hearts. And I would and everyone, the mistakes people make in explaining things, this would drive me, I can remember as like an 8-year-old being driven crazy by this. The thing you start with is, what is the point of the game? Start with that. The point of monopoly is to amass as many properties as you can and put everyone else bankrupt, right? You don't explain the game before you explain the point, right? And people would start without doing, and I would read the Parker Brothers instructions, and I would say, why didn't you tell me what the point is in the first sentence?
You were speaking my love language.
Yeah, really. To this day, this drives me nuts. Explain it properly, right? So I think that was where my career as a journalist was born.
Huh.
I grew up in a household where 60% of the members of my household could not explain the simplest thing to anybody else.
So before we go on from just the note about your father and higher education, I want to ask one quick, I don't want to talk long about this, but you certainly in your career as a journalist, you seem to have a pretty strong love-hate relationship with higher education.
Oh my God, don't even get me started. Yeah. Lee, you said we only have 90 minutes. I'm writing.
But give us a 3 to 4 minute excursus on that.
I mean, I can't.
No,
I can't
you can.
I can't even.
Okay. I'll ask follow-up questions.
Okay, I'll tell you. I'm writing a sequel to my first book, The Tipping Point. There is literally a chapter called "Why Does Harvard Have a Women's Rugby Team?" which is 6,000 words of explanation for why the school would do something that otherwise makes no sense. So when I say Harvard, do you really want me to? It's not that I'm fine with them having a club rugby team. They don't have a club, they have a varsity women's rugby team, and they go to like New Zealand to recruit people for it. They spend millions of dollars, well, not millions, but they got like multiple coaches, they fly around the country, they destroy other teams by the score of like 105-0. They have like a pro rugby team. By the way, and rugby is a terrible, terrible sport for anyone to play. It's like concussions, torn ACLs and broken bones. They introduced this in 2013. And they already, Harvard already has more varsity sports than any other college in the world.
I did not know that.
Oh yeah, by far. Ohio State doesn't even come close, or Alabama. Harvard's way off there. So I have a whole grand theory about why they're doing it, which I'm not going to go into because we don't have time. But my point is, yes, I am obsessed with even the smallest details. I have read stuff about, particularly Ivy League colleges, which I think are completely and utterly morally bankrupt and should be shut down tomorrow. And the idea that Americans stand by...
Wait, you can't just say that without asking a follow-up. What's the root of the moral bankruptcy?
Harvard is a school that educates, 10,000 students max, and has an endowment of $45 billion, which is subsidized by the American taxpayers. Can you think of a more absurd situation where a handful of schools, the total endowment of the Ivy League and Stanford is north of $100 billion. Collectively, they educate 100,000 students a year, a tiny, tiny drop in a bucket. Meanwhile, they're hoarding $120 billion, getting tax benefits, all of which is subsidized by the American taxpayer, and further, the government's funneling all kinds of cash towards them. And it's absurd. And at the other end of the equation, there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of students in this country who are holding enormous amounts of debt because the schools that they went to couldn't afford to give them financial aid. Who would construct such a system? Right? It makes no sense. If you're going to have $45 billion in the bank, the very least you should do is educate 100,000 students a year, at minimum. You should educate 10 times as many students as you do. In Canada, where I come from, the most prestigious school in Canada is the University of Toronto. It has an undergraduate population of 70,000 students, as it should. your most prestigious school should be your biggest school, right? Like, if you really do have the best faculty and the best facilities and the most money and the greatest reputation, you should try and help the maximum number of students. This is like saying, if I were to build the greatest hospital in the South, and I said, Lee, I'm going to open it in Nashville. It's going to be the greatest hospital in the world. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to let in 100 patients a year. I'm going to look at, you can bring in people on a stretcher and 50 a day, have the ambulances line up, and then I will spend the next 2 weeks assessing them. And I will choose one for admittance to my elite cardiac center, and one for I'll take in one. I'll have a neurosurgeon, and he'll do one operation a day, just to make sure it's the absolute top notch. If they did that, we would think that's bananas, right? Yet that's exactly the system we tolerate in American higher ed. It's preposterous. And by the way, I'm not done. What do rich people in this country do? They look at that state of affairs and they write increasingly large checks to the schools that already have the most money. That's even crazier, right? The marginal value of $1 given to Harvard University is zero. There's literally nothing they can do with that. Like, they're already, every base is already covered. If you gave $1 million to this college, I mean, we could talk all day about what that could do, what you would do with that. If you gave $1 million to Harvard, you might as well just burn it in front of Harvard, in Harvard Square. It's just crazy. And literally, not a week goes past when some hedge fund guy doesn't write a check for $200 million to Harvard University. And every time I see that, I just think, you are a moron, right?
Well, I'm glad that we found something that you're passionate about. So let me.
We released an audiobook of Pushkin, which was by me, entitled "I Hate the Ivy League." I was very proud of that. We were trying to pick the title, and they had all these complicated.
It's very interesting because on Sunday night we're going to talk about the fact that you say that you're trying to do work in which you help us become less judgy.
This is not judgmental. I'm just calling out the facts as I see them.
So I want to move to moral philosophy just a second. And actually, I'll do a quick callback to something you said a moment ago about roles and multiplicity of identities, which is something that narrative theology and moral philosophy that takes narrative and story seriously talks about that a lot. But it strikes me that, since the Enlightenment, moral philosophy typically has much more focused on rules and principles. Just tell us the right thing to do, rules and principles. But prior to the Enlightenment, a lot of ancient moral traditions, biblical, extra-biblical, they focused very much more on story. And that one of the fundamental moral practices was storytelling, because storytelling was fundamentally a morally formative practice in helping people think about their sense of self, about what they saw as beautiful and true and good. And obviously this wasn't moralistic storytelling, but it was story as a moral practice. And it seems to me that that's the kind of storytelling you like to do. That is, that you're trying to tell stories that invite us to a different sense of self or a different way of seeing the world that is then an invitation to be changed in some way. Do you resonate with that, or does that seem to be right?
So going back to that story I told about my Nashville story. So does the girl stop if at her Bible study they talked about how we have a moral obligation to help those less fortunate than us? Right? That's one option. That's what they could have studied if they were just interested in rules and principles. But they didn't. They studied a story, a very concrete story, about a member of a despised minority who goes out of his way to do something that makes no, to put himself, to put himself in, to put him. Does the Good Samaritan put himself in harm's way? No, but he disrupts his routine and puts himself to a lot of trouble to help someone he doesn't know, whereas is it the Levites who pass on by, right? Very concrete story. That's in her head. She's driving down the road, and what does she see? Someone in distress by the side of the road, and she has to put herself in some kind of jeopardy, potential jeopardy, to stop and help. And she has that story in her head, so she does it, right? Like, that's what a story can do. I don't think she stops if it's just a abstract thing. But there was some kind of, in the specifics of the story of the Good Samaritan, there is something really powerful that moves people in a way that the abstract discussion does not. Which is not to say the abstract discussion is without value.
Sure.
But there's a particular power attached to the story that, and I've always loved that. And, I did a podcast episode. I did this 6-part series on guns for the Revisionist History this year. And the last episode was I went to the University of Chicago and I was interviewing someone there and while I was there, she said, "Oh, you should really talk to my colleague, Abdullah." And so this totally random thing. And I went, "Oh, okay." And I go and meet this guy who's a ER doc at the University of Chicago, who grew up in the south side of Chicago, black guy, who chose to practice emergency medicine in the same neighborhood he grew up in, which is one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the country. And he was describing the experience of, on any given day, he will see someone brought in on a stretcher who's been shot, who's someone he knew. And there's a moment in the conversation where he talks about, I ask him how many friends he's had who have been killed. And he actually has this, he said, "Do you mean like people I was close enough to that they were in my phone? Like I'd been texting with him?" I go, "Yeah." And he goes, 15.
Oh.
Right? And the whole conversation is, and I had framed it in the episode is framed by this comment that I had done a couple of seasons ago, this whole thing about the Jesuits, thinking like a Jesuit. And this one Jesuit had said to me, "Sin is the failure to bother to care." And the whole episode is all about what does it mean to bother to care? Now, sin is the failure to bother to care is the abstract rule. This guy, Abdullah Price's decision to forego a much easier, more lucrative life practicing as an ER doc in a suburb someplace, to go back and practice in his own neighborhood and run the risk of this traumatic thing where it's kids he knows coming in, right? That's a story. It's real about his choices, and it's just emotionally moving and it makes that principle come to life, right?
Yeah, right.
Suddenly you get, what's the Jesuit mean when he says sin is the failure to bother to care? He means that. He means you have to make the same kind of choice that guy made, right?
So when you think about stories that you want to tell, is it a sort of intuitive discernment, or do you have some sort of set of criteria that you run it through? What's a story that you feel compelled to tell look like or shaped like? Or
well, I mean, there's sometimes you get a perfect story, not very often, but that Abdullah Price thing was very close to a perfect story in that I didn't have to do anything. The greatest stories are the ones where your role as the storyteller is it's at its absolute minimum. You barely have to ask any questions. You barely have to change what you're given. You just kind of trim it and run it. That's the perfect story, where it just comes out in one, because every time you intervene with a story, with the person telling the story, you bias it, you change it, you get those rarely, and when you get them, you have to understand. About 10 minutes into that Abdullah Price thing, I had to understand that this is one of those occasions where I need to keep my mouth shut. I had an agenda coming in. I need to put it aside and just listen, right? And kind of. But other times you have to construct it yourself. It's not always perfect, but you can be kind of. So I have a chapter in the book I'm writing now about about a COVID super spreading event, where I really had to, it's like the worst of all of the super spreading events, where I had to like make a lot of phone calls and read a lot of things to kind of pull it out. Is it a perfect story? No, it's pretty good though. It's like, it takes the reason it was important to tell that story about that is that if you just mention the word COVID to people now, they just eyes glaze over.
Right.
Nobody, you know. So you have to do something to kind of bring it back to exhume it.
You have referred to the fact that when you were younger, you needed to learn to write without anxiety. Unpack that for us. What's that looked like for you? Let me first begin with the question. So early on, what did your anxiety about writing look like? What was it concerned with?
A lot of it was about structure, which I think is the normal beginner's anxiety. Is everything in the right? And also because I continue to be very, very, very obsessed with the structure of a story. In the way that this, I wish I could remember the specifics of it, but I heard some interview where some famous musician, can't remember who, was doing a show, and I think like Steve Martin or Chris Rock or some comedian listened, or Jerry Seinfeld, and called him up and said, that story you tell 20 minutes in, your punchline's in the wrong place. You got to flip it. And they're like, oh, and they go back and do the show again, and this time they get a huge laugh. It's the same story, only the comedian said, you're stepping on your, comedians are obsessed with what they're working on when they're, they spend months kind of road testing their jokes. And that's a lot of what they're concerned about is the structure of the joke. It really matters how it's ordered. And it's a natural writer's thing that you care deeply about. You realize it really matters how
So the anxiety is about the craft.
Yes, and the hump I had to get over was, you're never going to get it right the first time. So you just do it. Come back to it and do it again. Come back to it and show it to some people and do it again. And you'll eventually get there.
Yeah.
Right.
So how does that relate, if at all, to anxiety about how people respond to your stories in terms of whether you're liked?
Yeah. I don't have a lot of anxiety about I'm not very thin-skinned. I don't really care that much. I mean, if enough, I'm happy if some people like it. And there's always some people who like it. I used to have this rule of thumb.
That's classic understatement, though, Malcolm. I mean, at one level, it seems too easy for you to say that when you've sold as many millions of books as you have.
Yeah. Well, so I'll tell you, I used to use the following, but early in my career, I came up with the following algorithm, which is enormously comforting. And it is as follows. Let us imagine...
I wonder if your father was a PhD in mathematics.
Yes, right. Yeah. Let's imagine that for any person who creates something, 80% of those who encounter it, this is very generous, but 80% of those who encounter it like it, and 20% dislike it, okay? So if 100 people read your book, you're going to have 20 people who hate it and 80 who like it, right? That's a success in the sense that you have 4x more people who like it than hate it. If you sell 1 million copies, that means you have 200,000 people who hate what you did. If you sell 10 million copies, you have 2 million people who hate you.
The whole state of Tennessee hates you.
The whole state of Tennessee hates you. The more popular you are, the greater the number of your critics, right? But you have to remember, the noise of your critics is simply a function of the size of your fans, right? So if you remember that, then it's all fine. So then you're like, people say like, oh, I read this horrible review, and I'm like, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
It means that like below that.
It means something, yeah.
Yeah.
You seem to like stories about courage a lot. At least it seems that I don't know that I've heard you use the word courage a lot. But does that seem to resonate with you, that you're paying attention especially?
I'd never thought about that. It's interesting. Do you think?
I do.
Yeah.
I mean, I could be wrong.
No, I don't.
Yeah.
I have never kind of systematically thought about what I'm attracted to in terms of stories.
Huh.
But maybe that I mean, yeah, I guess that makes sense. I'd never thought about it.
Do you think much about courage yourself as a human being? How to facilitate it, or ever having had a lack of it, or?
Do I? I don't know. I mean, I do, I do have a kind of, I object to people who are excessively timid about voicing what they believe. I don't object to that's too strong. I don't understand excessive timidity about. I think it should be fine to say. We had this discussion, in my little company that I have. Particularly younger people, I don't think it's a function of the generation they belong to. I just think it's one of the things that young people take a little time to learn is that it's fine to be in an environment with people who disagree with you about things. That's just life. It's fine. It doesn't matter. It can be kind of fun, right? But I think the impulse, especially when we're like in our early 20s, is to see difference and to be kind of alarmed by it and to want to kind of, to either see it as a sign of dysfunction or a sign of like, of some impending trauma, or they exaggerate the significance of the disagreement as opposed to seeing it as natural. I also would argue that this is a symptom of what is awry about the kind of American political discussion at the moment, where there's just way too much anxiety about our differences and way too little attention paid to what we have in common, which is way greater than differences are, in the grand scheme of things, relatively trivial, right? But they're taken as if society is coming apart at the seams. Is society really coming apart at the seams? I just have great difficulty with that. Like, when I talk to people, it's so much easier to find things you agree with them about than disagree, right? I've conversations.
So you're not concerned about the state of American society?
Well, I'm only concerned in the sense that I think we're shooting ourselves in the foot by spending all of our time dwelling on what we disagree about and not dwelling on what we agree about. We agree about most things. I mean, there's some whack jobs who have crazy, but even there, we spend all of our time obsessing about what the whack jobs think. Well, why would you spend all your time thinking about someone you think is a lunatic?
Yeah.
Right?
So going back to a kind of morally formative story and practices, another thing that I think I have heard you use this language. I'm not sure that you have, but at least it seems to me that in some of the stories you tell, you want things like courage or generosity or even sacrifice to be more accessible to people. It seems like you don't want that to be some sort of overly heroic thing.
Yeah.
Am I still reading too much into?
No, I think that's something that makes put that way. I think it does. Yeah, I think like there is a lot more kind of intuitive selflessness in people, I think, than we give them credit for. And there are very strong traditions about selflessness and generosity in this country and elsewhere that are really powerfully formative of who we are. And we should spend more time kind of, I thought of this the other day. I did this really fun conversation with these two women had written books that were chiefly about what's wrong with kids' sports. Right, this is a subject that I love to opine on as well. And we were talking about all the things we could do to fix kids' sports. We should do away with college athletic scholarships, which I think is a really good idea. We went down the list. One of my rules is you should never spend more time driving to a kid's sporting event than the sporting event itself, right? So if it's...
You just killed all Nashville sports.
Yeah. If it's a 1-hour soccer game, you should not spend more than an hour driving to the soccer game. That's just nuts for a 12-year-old. Like, this is crazy. But the one thing that they talked a lot about is that we played with this idea that parents shouldn't go to their kids' games. And they were half joking, but half serious, because they were making this point that when parents go to a kid's game, it's not for the benefit of the kid, it's for the benefit of the parent. And the presence of parents as a group, as a whole, rarely enhances the experience of the child, right? It adds anxiety. It's this thing the kid wants to do on their own with their friends, and then mom and dad are there screaming and embarrassing them, and then someone else's dad is like, blah, blah, blah. But then they started talking about the effect on coaches. And they said, we've made it almost impossible to be a coach in America anymore, because the coach spends all of his or her time dealing with the parents. And that's not why they went into coaching, right? They went into coaching because they wanted to teach kids how to do something and to be selfless in their experience with the kid. And the parents are ruining it by screaming at the phone about why didn't, Johnny play, or why are you training Janie this way? And so there's a case where we have a group of people in this country who are willing to take time out from and typically these are people with families themselves, who are willing to take time out to do something for nothing on behalf of your children, right? And to put the needs and wants and desires and hopes and whatever of your children first. And what do? We make their lives miserable. It's nuts. So they were saying, just stop it. No parents. Maybe they can come to the championship game and they can be put in a place far away where they can't be heard. But like regular games, no. And I thought this is genius. Every parent ultimately, if they thought about it, would accept the logic of this, right? Parents will do, if they knew that no parents could go, then they would say, okay, that's fine, I'll do that, right? But it goes to this point of like, we're indifferent to the plight of the coach, right? Why are we indifferent to the plight of the coach? It doesn't make, like, why do we kind of why are we so unwilling to honor the sacrifice that person is making? That's the point, the key point they were making, right? Like all kinds of people in our society are willing to do something outside of themselves. And if someone is willing to take that step, if you're not going to do it yourself, your job is not to get in the way, right? Say thank you, put some money in the collection box and move on if you're not willing to help, right? I've had it with the people who make the lives of that class of people miserable.
I want to talk about happiness a second. So in this kind of school of moral theory that I've raised here, happiness defined a particular way is seen as the point of life. And so I thought I wanted to do a little short experiment here. And I wanted to read you a short passage from a Catholic theologian whose work I like, Paul Waddell. And I've used his book in a number of my ethics classes. It's a book called Happiness and the Christian Moral Life. And I want to see what you make of it. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So Waddell says this: the trajectory of our lives can be read as an endless pursuit of whatever we think will satisfy us, content us, and fulfill us. All of that reveals what we believe will bring us happiness and satisfaction. The trouble, however, is that we are often confused and easily misled about what will really fulfill us. Then, he's talking about Aquinas and Aristotle, he says, for Aquinas and Aristotle, happiness does not reside in having my wants and desires satisfied unless I have learned to want and desire what is best. The heart of Christian ethics, Waddell argues, is not about laws and rules and principles and obligations, but about being initiated into a way of life capable of making one good and therefore happy. Christian morality is most promisingly described as training in happiness, and re-envision the basic elements of morality in light of that training.
Mm-hmm. That's lovely. Isn't that lovely?
I think it's lovely.
Yeah.
Why do you find it lovely?
I like that idea that, well, first of all, I like that it comes it gives us a definition of the purpose of Christianity or a religious life that's different. That it adds to our understanding of that. And I like the idea that I love any kind of notion that says that our intuitive desires are that left to our own devices, we often get things wrong. I like that. That's an important reminder. We just willy-nilly follow what's in our gut. We could, as often as not, screw up, right? My book, Blink, which was misinterpreted as a book celebrating gut instincts, when in fact it was the opposite, was about this. Like, unless you're an expert, your instincts lead you astray. You need to educate them in some way. And the idea that one of those civilizing institutions in life is the church is a really good one. That's like I love the way he phrased it. Mm.
You're 60?
Don't remind me.
Are you happy?
Yeah. I mean, yes, I do think I'm happy. It's funny, I never asked myself that question. I think of happiness as being that comes to mind in very, very discrete moments. So I'm much more comfortable saying, I was happy doing X, or I was happy when I was, do you know what I mean? Like,
you say you do say that to yourself?
Yeah.
I was happy when I was doing such and so.
I sat, I fixed a problem in a chapter I was working on this morning in a little coffee shop in Nashville. I was happy when I realized I'd fixed it. Mm. Or I will go running this afternoon afterward with this. I will be happy when that running is in the middle of that running. That's how I like to think about happiness.
Yeah, yeah. What about when you think about being 60, what regrets or hardest lessons learned, to whatever degree you want to talk about those, what would be some of those that you've worked through that have been important in the kind of person you've become?
Not very good about, I rarely look back. So kind of, I must have regrets. I suppose I have a lot, but they're not like, the problem is that very often the mistakes you made or the failures you have turn out to be so important in educating you, and that in the end you don't think of them as mistakes anymore. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah. So
I do firmly believe that you learn way more from your failures than you do from your successes. I don't think success teaches you much at all. And what really, the only thing that prods you to dig deeper is when something doesn't work or when something fails. So after a lifetime of that, can you really look on your failures as being, can you classify them as regrettable? They're not regrettable because I came out different than so I get confused by that question because I don't know how to categorize. There was a period in my life where I spent a huge amount of time in Freudian therapy, right? 3 days a week.
You were receiving therapy.
I was receiving it.
Yeah.
I was in Manhattan. I was new to Manhattan. I was like, all right, that's what they do here. And I had a job that wasn't that demanding. You can't have a demanding job.
You can't what?
Have a demanding job and be in 3 days a week Freudian therapy, because it just wipes out the whole day, right? There's something that happens, by the way, So I have this whole thing in my new book. It's top of mind. I have this whole thing on the magic number 3. 3 is a magic number. So if you go to 3, so you do 1 day a week, it's like fine, whatever. Lots of people do 1 day a week. You do 2, it's like a lot. You do 3, it completely takes over your life. Nothing, everything else fades into insignificance. You are someone who does therapy. That's what your self-definition is. Is, by the way, astounding how it takes over your life. I've never been through anything equivalent to this.
How long a period of your life was this?
I probably was in 3 days a week for, I don't even remember, probably was a year. It was traumatic. It was like, couldn't function, stopped being productive at work, had the most horrendous nightmares. Everything, my unconscious, because all the Freudians care about is your unconscious. My unconscious basically took over my life for a year. Was a massive amount of time and a massive amount of money was spent on this. It's the lost year in my. So you might say, was that a regret? No, because actually, it didn't solve any of my problems, but it was, in retrospect, a failure that was deeply fascinating.
Yeah.
That taught me something really extraordinary about, not really my mind, but about the human mind.
Right.
Man, there is a thing called your unconscious, and it is ginormous. It sits in your brain wanting to get out, and if you even so much as crack the door, it will rush out and take over your life. It's just, we are scary, right, human beings. That was a really interesting to learn, right? I mean, a very costly lesson, but who knows what book I could have written in that last year. But I'm glad I did it.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and that reminds me of you reframing the notion of the regrettable, that another theologian I've learned a lot from and is now a friend, Stanley Hauerwas, and when he talks about this way of thinking about our lives, I once heard him do a lecture where he was talking, I don't remember who it was, but it was a man who went to Oxford, got trained in literature, and was a poet. But then after some time, he decided he wanted to go back home and be a shepherd. Mm-hmm. And so he was a shepherd, and he was a shepherd who would write poetry. And at some point on into his life, near the end of his life, he wrote this essay in which he examined the ups and downs of his life. And then he came to the conclusion, this is my life. I want no other. And then Hauerwas said, that's the meaning of a happy life. Is that you can look back on your life, whatever's happened, and say, I want this life.
My friend Bruce has this wonderful corollary to that, which is he had problems with jealousy. He was open about it. And he cured his problems with jealousy by saying, you can no longer be envious of a piece of someone's life. You have to want the whole life. So you have to say, okay, I wish I looked like Brad Pitt. You're a little envious of Brad Pitt. He's a handsome dude. Then you have to say, no. You can't just have his looks. You gotta have his whole life. You really want his whole life? No, you don't want his whole life. You want Angelina Jolie, filing suits against you, and you can't go to the store and get like a pint of milk because you'll be mobbed. I mean, you're a prisoner, right? It's a horrendous life, right? You think about it, you're living in some grotesque house in LA and you can't go out without, some guy's got to pull up in a Suburban to take you in, a black Suburban with tinted windows so you can, go to the movies. I mean, you don't want it, right? And if you go down the list, you realize you actually don't want anyone's life except your own. It's really, really a useful.
That is very useful. Yeah. It's striking how timid you are about saying what you think. Okay, I want to shift the conversation. Another phrase that I know I've heard you say repeatedly is a weeper. Uh-huh. He'll say, this is a real weeper.
Yeah.
So getting ready for you coming to Nashville, I was listening to your episode, The King of Tears.
Yeah.
Which I would imagine a lot of people in Nashville listen to. It revolves around Nashville and country music. And it's woven together with all these beautiful layers of storytelling about Bobby Braddock, famed Nashville songwriter who you're calling the King of Tears because he's written all of these amazing songs that are just weepers. And you're especially weaving it together around his song, He Stopped Loving Her Today, which George Jones made famous.
Saddest song of all time.
Yeah. And so while listening to this episode, I was down on the floor in my house scraping baseboards, getting ready for the painters to come.
Did you start crying?
That's my story. I can't believe you did that. I would never do that to one of your stories. So I'm down on the floor, scraping baseboards, getting ready for the painters. And you come to this climactic moment of, recounting George Jones' funeral.
Yeah.
And then you weave into Vince Gill singing his own weeper, Go Rest High.
Yeah.
And there I am, down on my hands and knees, sobbing, as Vince Gill himself breaks down at George Jones' funeral and cannot get himself through his own song, Go Rest High.
Yeah.
And so I'm sitting there, sobbing, tears running down my face. And then you say something like, and if you're not crying, there's nothing I can do for you.
I can't help you.
I can't help you.
I can't help you.
I can't help you. So what's behind your fascination with weepers?
Well, it's too easy to make someone laugh. People were just laughing now, right? Super easy. How hard is that? Why would you get any credit as a storyteller if you can make somebody laugh? Making someone cry? So, under what circumstances could I make some portion of you right now cry? Really hard, right? I mean, so I'm naturally attracted to the more difficult of the narrative tasks. So crying is fascinating. Like, I once saw Mitch Albom. I once saw Mitch Albom, the writer Mitch Albom, who was the king of the weeper, right? He once, I don't know if you ever heard him speak. It's funny because can I name drop? I was just on the phone with Mitch Albom today. And I was reminded of all this. So I met him for the first time. We were both speaking at a conference, and it was in Sacramento, California, and it was a bunch of builders, real estate guys. 90% male, middle-aged, wealthy, kind of Republican, serious Northern California kind of guys, right? It's 9:00 in the morning. Mitch is giving a talk, right? And I thought, I'm going to sit in on Mitch's talk just to see what's going on, right? Mitch gets up there. He's like the opposite of them. He's like this tall, Jewish guy from Detroit, gets up there. It's not, first of all, I can't stress enough, it's 9:00 in the morning. So, emotion does not happen 9:00 in the morning in Sacramento, California. Mitch gets up there, and 20 minutes in, the entire room is in tears. And I was like, and me too. Tears? And I'm like, dude, you are a genius. He's a genius. How did you do that? It's like, he's not, I don't know if you ever heard him speak. It's not like he's not Martin Luther King. He's not the king of, he just has this way of telling a story and touching in a real way. He's not manipulative. It's real. That's actually the other thing is, if he was trying to manipulate you into tears, it wouldn't have worked. It was real. He told a story and it was like his hand reached into everybody's chest and grabbed their heart. And it was crazy. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is some powerful stuff, right? I saw him do it again then. He gave a talk. I did a podcast on this college in Michigan, Hope College, and which is it's a Christian college, the president of the college wants to abolish tuition, and go to a pay it forward thing where when you graduate you give back to the school whatever you want to give back. It's a really beautiful idea, and profoundly centered in his understanding of the Christian mission. And Mitch heard about this. Mitch is, again, he's not an evangelical Christian. He's heard about what they were doing at Hope. And Mitch has been going to, Mitch Albom has flown to Haiti every month for the last 15 years because he has an orphanage that he's funded there. And he wanted to send some of his kids to Hope College, and they could afford to come if there was no tuition, right? And so Mitch gave a speech about what he was doing, and it was the same thing. It was like 10 minutes in, everybody is weeping. I mean, I'm close to weeping right now, just remembering, like, it's like amazing, right? And in that case, it was like, he was an outsider to the group, which was important. So he was someone, and he was like, I'm not of your world. I'm not a evangelical Christian. I didn't go to Hope College. I'm not from Hope, Michigan. I'm from Detroit. I'm just a guy who heard about this. So that was sort of emotionally important, that he had come all the way without any ties to the institution. And then he told the story about his transformation. He used to be he was just a sports writer looking out for himself, trying to make a lot of money. Blah, blah, blah. And he met, remember his famous book, Tuesdays with Morrie. He meets this guy who's dying of Lou Gehrig's disease, I think it was Lou Gehrig's disease, and who refuses to give in to self-pity. And even as he's on his deathbed, just wants to, and Mitch is transformed by that. It's this Damascus moment, right? On the road to Damascus, he has this kind of, and he realizes he's not living his own life and he really, since that, anyway, he tells that story, and it's just so, there was something about that was so real, and again, like, when I hear stories like that, I'm blown away, both because I'm emotionally responding to it, but also I feel like I want to do that. I want to be capable of that.
So what do you think is the line between kind of manipulative or mawkish sentimentality on one side and emotion that somehow is speaking to the fullness or the richness of life or the possibilities of living life well? What's that?
Well, it's simple. It's whether it's, there are Hallmark commercials that can get you a little weepy. But that's not real. You know that. And then you stop crying. Sure, you don't actually break down. You just you have a little bit of unchecked emotion, and then you're like, whoa, it's a commercial. I'm not gonna, there's one, and then I remember there was a famous, I say famous to me. There was an ad for Google once, for Google Chat or something. It was a TV commercial, and you see the daughter who's just gone off to college, and you see the dad who's chatting with her. And it's like the dad's typing in the chat line, I miss you so much, blah, blah, blah. It's been, and then you realize, it's been so long since, mom left us or something. And you realize she's his only daughter. His wife, the mom, has died. And as he's typing that thing about mom to her on Google Chat, the cursor slows down. So you realize he's choking up, right? It's insanely manipulative. If I showed it to you right now, we're all in tears. But that's not real, right? It's like a clever guy on Madison Avenue comes up with this way of, and you remember it, but you remember it as an act of manipulation, not a malicious act of manipulation, but you're like, your hat's off to the person who did that. That's not what I'm talking about. I don't want someone to take their hat off. Oh, Malcolm, right? I want it real. Those Mitch Albom stories are real. They're like, you think about them and you ask questions about your own life. Like, would I have done that? Should I be doing that? Why am I not doing that? Right? Why am I not the Good Samaritan? Like, that's a very, very, very different kind of, that's the kind of story that's important and powerful.
Now, you said earlier today, did you say something like that you just get emotional easily yourself, generally?
About my dad.
About your dad?
Very few things, but with him, it's like...
Yeah. You're not that much emotional about other things?
No. It's funny. It's really, I think he stands for something, a whole constellation of things, and then that's the trigger.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Can I ask you just one follow-up about that? When you think about the constellation of things that he stands for, what are some of those that stand out to you?
Sorry.
Want to go on?
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you.
Sorry.
You were raised in a Christian home. You identify as a Christian now?
Yes. It's a difficult question to answer because I never liked the experience of going to church. Not because I thought there was something wrong with going to church, but the form of it didn't suit me. But there are other ways of encountering spirituality that do suit me. And I think it took me a long time to realize that that religiosity is not about church going. They're connected, but they're not the same thing.
Was there a time in your life where you would have said, I'm not a Christian?
No, I've always, because I've always been aware of how powerful it is. And I don't know of anything that's as powerful as that. So it's not anything that I could ever kind of dismiss. I think people who dismiss religiosity are people who just don't know anything about it, who've just never experienced.
So when you think about stories, you being a journalist, you like to tell stories, and you like stories that have a particular kind of impact or power to them, and you just talked about the power of that Christian narrative. What are some of the things of that narrative that stand out to you as powerful?
I'll tell us. So I have a really good friend who, he's actually my brother's best friend, who's a Mennonite pastor. And I've sort of got to know him myself well over the years. And I remember a moment where I had brought a friend of mine to dinner with this guy. This guy's name is Jim. And Jim knew him only very vaguely. And this friend of mine sat next to Jim. And my friend had gone through a lot of family turmoil. Marriage was in trouble. One of his children had committed suicide. He didn't speak of it at all during the dinner. And then afterwards, Jim came up to me and said, that guy's in pain, right? And I realized that a lifetime of serving others, because of in the spirit of Christ, had opened him up to people in a way that it was an extraordinary observation to make about someone. I think we probably talked about politics or football or the stock market. Who knows? I don't even know. And Jim, his sort of sensitivity to that was such that he understood that something was going on. And I think that is not something you can manufacture on your own. I think that comes out of a kind of commitment to seeing people a certain way. Or it's the same guy, there were a bunch of Ukrainian refugees came to Canada right during the war. And Jim took an entire family into his house. Jim's house is tiny. They were there for a year. It's Jim, he's they finally left. But a decision he made without even thinking. It's of course. come and share my house. Jim doesn't have a lot of money. Like I said, doesn't have a big house. I mean, he just kind of, that kind of thing that's super powerful, and it doesn't, 99% of people are not doing that, right?
Yeah.
So you have to kind of, it's stuff like that where a lifetime of seeing people in that position do that makes you realize you're dealing with something different. And you have to honor that, right? You can't, it's not part of the kind of conventional experience, moral experience of most people.
When I first talked to you on the phone a number of weeks ago, I don't remember how we got to this point in the conversation, but you said something like, well, if you just read the New Testament, it's very clear that we're a long ways away from that and really not doing much of what the New Testament says. Unpack that for us a little more.
What was the context in which I said that? What were we talking about?
I don't remember. No, I don't remember.
I just forget what the context is for I like to make pronouncements, as you've discovered. But yeah, we're, like, Jesus is a pretty radical dude, right? Goes around talking about how hard it is for rich people to reach the kingdom of heaven. Not exactly a mainstream notion in America at the moment. So there's that. There's a lot in I gave this talk, this is not about the New Testament, but the Old, but I give talks, one of the things I do. And I was giving a talk to this is something I wanted to talk about tomorrow. I won't talk about trust, about Proverbs. Anyway, let's leave that for now. But I just think it's like it's an odd thing to read the Bible with a kind of open mind, right? Because it's so much, the genius of the book is that it could have been read at any point over the last couple thousand years, and each generation makes sense of it. But that's also, it's problematic because each generation just tends to pick the parts they like and dismiss the rest, right? A universal text is always going to have that problem, that it permits a degree of subjective reading that, so we're, I think, at a moment where our subjectivity around the New Testament is maybe at its height. But
yeah. You are in a new season of life. You have a 2-year-old and a 12-week-old?
I do. And when I told you an hour ago that my 3-month-old last night slept from 6:30 to 6:30.
It's just wrong. It's like you're not really a parent yet, Malcolm.
And my other one has slept through the night every single night since she was 3 months old. I'm sorry to boast because it's really unseemly, but come on. People tell me, I guess other parents had this experience of waking up. I don't know what that's like.
Unbelievable. So what are things about your own life that you're seeing anew or afresh with little ones?
It's really fun.
I guess so, on a full night's sleep.
On a full night's sleep. Everything I say, one thing that I love is that everything that I used to roll my eyes over, new parents saying, I now say. So it's fantastic. I've now I have become everything I once despised. And no one loves becoming everything he once despised more than me. I'm also aware that, the thing that you do as a young parent is you say something about your child like you've discovered it and everyone else knows this.
Yes.
I love that as well. And there's this, I didn't know about the secret fraternity of parents so you're in a social situation and then you seek out the person with kids your age and then you just have a conversation about diapers and potty.
Yeah.
And, and Miss Rachel and all this stuff. And no one else knows what you're talking about or even cares. I love that as well. I'm now part of the secret fraternity. It's great. I have opinions about, the hungry caterpillar. I did not know what the hungry caterpillar was, 2 years ago. By the way, children's books are so terrible. Someone has got to fix this. I read half the time. I'm reading some book to Edie. Like we read a book, in the morning, and I get halfway through, and I'm like, we're not reading this. This is terrible. They'll have half of them have agendas that have nothing to do with 2-year-old life. I just like, who publishes these books? And then celebrities do children's books. You buy the celebrity book. I bought the Colin Kaepernick book. What was he thinking? Colin Kaepernick should not be writing children's books. They don't understand. My 2-year-old does not understand, it's just craziness. So now, of course, I want to do what every parent wants to do, is write a children's book.
So thinking about the children's book that you might write, but thinking more about your boys, girls?
2 girls.
2 girls. Thinking about what you would hope that your girls would learn from you as father. What might that look like?
Well, I'm obsessed with them becoming runners. So I take Edie, my 2.5-year-old, and we go running. I know I'm on the way to becoming precisely the parent I was attacking earlier. I'm overly involved in critiquing her running form. I take videos and I send them to my running friends, and I'm like, do you know what heel striking is? It's what you're not supposed to do as a runner. Yeah. But many people heel strike. I'm like, is Edie heel striking? I send these videos. So I really want them to be runners, to at least to love. I want them to be active. That's all I really care about. And do I care about anything else? No, I think it's just running at the moment. That's really what I'm focused on with them. But I worry, and then I have all the standard, 2023 parental worries, social media. Also. It's a long way away, but I do. The world seems a little. Suddenly, you get very, 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 very concerned about how scary the world is. Right?
Yeah. I've got one last question. It may be one that's easy for you to dismiss, but let me ask you to dig for a potential answer to it. What is a question you wish I would ask you?
Oh. Wish is a strong word. I have no idea. I don't know. I thought you did a really good job.
No, that's not what I'm looking for.
Yeah. It's hard.
Let me. You may try again.
Yeah, try again.
What is there about Malcolm Gladwell that you've not given us any glimpse of that you would be happy for people to get a glimpse of?
That's a good question. It's a very good question. Okay, now I get it. I think a lot about work and effort and how important effort is to me in my own life and in my estimations of others. That what I want to see from myself and from the people around me is I want to see some level of commitment. And that as I get older, what I'm less and less, I'm going to sound very, very 19th century when I say this, I've become less and less tolerant of idleness. And I mean that in a very, very kind of specific way, and that is, you have to care about something. I don't care what it is. You have to care about something, and you have to make a sacrifice in pursuit of that thing you care about, and you have to try, right? And if you're not caring, putting some effort towards something and making a commitment to it, then honestly, I don't have any way to relate to you anymore. I don't. I can't. I don't have room in my life for people who who don't have a connection to whatever it is. Like I said, I don't really care what it is. I want someone to find something that they apply themselves to, because if you're not doing that, I don't understand why you're here, right? I don't think we were put here to twiddle our thumbs. I just don't. I wouldn't have said that at 25, because at 25, I think I was, in some sense, twiddling my thumbs. And I look back on that with a little bit of horror. In my 20s, I did what people in their 20s do. I partied a lot, and I would sleep in until 1 o'clock on a Sunday, and I don't understand that anymore. And I don't know. I'm not sure this feeling I have is correct. I worry that it's ungenerous and whatever, but it just is. It's just like, that's what and when I think about the people I surround myself with now, I've kept the people who care about something, and I have not kept the people who I think don't. I don't know. Is that like I said, I don't know. Is that, I don't know whether that is, like I said, I don't know whether that's fair, but it just is,
Well, we thank you for the way that you have cared and that you have sought to make a contribution, and we're grateful for that, and grateful for your presence today. Thankful for your sharing your real self with us today.
Yeah.
So please show your thanks to Malcolm Gladwell. Hey there, it's Lee. If you've been enjoying No Small Endeavor, then I'm excited to tell you about the podcast Jesuitical, produced by our friends at America Magazine, The Jesuit Review. Hosted by two millennial Catholics, Ashley McKinless and Zach Davis, it's a show that explores the complex and sometimes confusing questions about faith in today's world. It's fun, welcoming, and they usually talk it out over drinks. We Southern Protestants could never get away with that. I guess maybe unless you're Episcopalian. But I suppose I digress. Each week, they discuss a bit of Catholic news, interview a special guest, and open up about their own spiritual journeys while inviting their guests and listeners to do the same. Jesuitical is all about having honest and inviting conversations for both saints and sinners, with a wide range of guests like comedian Sarah Silverman, New York Times columnist Ross Douthat, and Catholic spiritual guru Richard Rohr. Whether you're sitting in a pew on Sunday or on a bar stool on Friday, Jesuitical might just be the podcast for you. So go ahead, follow Jesuitical on your favorite podcast app. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriet Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Ellis Osborne, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.
From PRX.